Welcome back again. We have now reached the third and final part of this introductory lecture. And where we left off, we had just gone through the cost-benefit analysis step by step. And I promised you that I would offer some revisions, some suggested modifications, if you will, tweaks to that process, and that's what I will do now. So, motivating part of that revision is the question of who are the right stakeholders, right? And is identifying the proper stakeholders a missing step? It's implicit in places, but should in fact be identified as a missing step. After all, whose costs and benefits matter anyway? Who are the relevant stakeholders, right? Or one way that they talk about this in cost-benefit analysis is who has standing, right? Who do we care about, right? From whose perspective are we conducting this analysis? It's important that we don't define the relevant stakeholders too narrowly. The Army in particular directs that you to consider costs and benefits of the entire, quote, Army enterprise, unquote, not just a single command or organization, right? So something that you do may benefit your command or organization, but in effect, create effects that raise costs for others, or vice versa, right? You may choose not to pursue an alternative because the benefits don't outweigh the costs, but there are benefits outside your command or organization such that the overall benefits to the Army enterprise do outweigh the costs. Now, so you should certainly, at the least, make sure you're looking at it from an Army enterprise perspective. But OMB Circular A94, which talks about federal government programs, goes even farther. It says analyses should include comprehensive estimates of the expected benefits and costs to society, underlined, and it's underlined in the original, document. Social net benefits and not the benefits and costs of the federal government should be the basis for evaluating government programs or policies that have effects on private citizens or other levels of government. Again, the overall net benefits to society, not the benefits and costs to the federal government, right? So even if the cost-benefit analysis says it doesn't make sense for the federal government, the costs exceed the benefits to the federal government, if the social net benefits are positive, then you would do it overall, if it benefits society. Again, this is probably a broader perspective than you will be asked to take in a lot of your cost-benefit analysis. But certainly understand that that's the role of government, is to maximize overall welfare for the society, right? Not the net benefits for the particular organization, the particular branch, the particular part of the government. So if I was going to do a more complete CBA process, first of all, the first two steps are unchanged, right? You define the scope, the problem, or opportunity, you formulate the assumptions and identify constraints. But I might put in here a step between the original 2 and 3, which is to identify the relevant stakeholders, right? And this is whether this is beneficial to make sure that we're counting the right costs and the right benefits, right? So you want to think about whose benefits and costs count, right? Do we think just about the specific command or organization, the Army enterprise as a whole? At the very least, we do that. What about the entire DoD, including all branches, right? What if it makes sense for the Army to do something, but what if it has a negative impact on the Navy or the Marine Corps, right? In particular, for example, when it comes to budgeting time, there are certainly things that happen, I've noticed, where everybody is scrambling for the defense dollar, and it's not clear that it's in the overall best interest, right? When we have the Army competing with the Navy, competing with the Air Force for funds, and whether it be supposed to be humanitarian disaster relief efforts, there's certain monies for those things, and each branch wants to talk about how they are best at doing that effort, right? Again, this is something that you may not have to address, but understand that even if we look at an Army enterprise perspective, it's not necessarily the case that what's best for the Army enterprise is going to be best for the overall DoD, or looking for all branches of the military. What about looking at the entire federal government, right? Or the entire nation, right? The social benefits. But even then, what about the entire world, right? We think about those humanitarian disaster relief efforts, right? If we talk about the benefit to those who are in need, to what degree do their benefits count, right? Do we count the benefits to them? So whether it's, tsunami relief or whatever it might be, right? So again, it's just, you sort of have this prescription to look for the Army enterprise perspective, and that is your directive. So putting this step here, and make sure that you at least remember to include the Army enterprise perspective. But it also raises in your mind the idea of, is it only the Army enterprise perspective? But is this particular cost-benefit analysis, should it incorporate something beyond the Army enterprise perspective, right? And in some cases, by the way, it may be that the issue is so narrow that you only need to focus about the specific command or organization. The Army enterprise as a whole benefits simply because that specific command or organization benefits. Step 4, define the alternatives. Unchanged. It was formerly step 3, but I retain that same step. I would then, step 5, define the criteria by which the alternative will be selected. That's not a new criteria, although I've rephrased it. Remember, it was define alternative selection criteria, and I thought that was confusing. But define criteria by which alternative will be selected. That was there before. But remember, it was after you did your cost and benefit analysis. You analyzed costs, you analyzed benefits, and then you defined the criteria by which the alternative will be selected. Well, that's a little bit suspicious sometimes, right? The idea is, ideally, you should choose how you're going to pick a winner before you play the game, right? You can't say, okay, we're going to play a game of soccer, but I'm not going to tell you how you win. And then in the end, you say, okay, well, actually the winner is the team that got the least amount of goals, right? Saying how you get a winner after you already know the score is a little unfair, right? So in order to avoid potential bias, whether it be conscious or unconscious, in favor of one course of action or a selected set of course of action, or against one course of action, right? You really should choose the decision criteria before you assign costs and benefits, right? Sort of blindly before you sort of blind justice, if you will. Now, what we do at this stage, in terms of defining the criteria by which alternative will be selected, really depends on whether or not the costs and benefits are monetizable, right? And again, so there's an argument here that the criteria can't really be fully developed until you know something about the costs and benefits, right? But certainly if they can all be monetizable, right, then you simply compare the net benefits. But if not, we have to define an appropriate criteria by which we would make our choice if we have non-monetizable costs or non-monetizable benefits, or both. Moving on, after the next 2 steps, I label identify and catalog impacts of each course of action, and then quantify, in other words, assign a value to each impact. Now, remember before, in the Army process, they did analyze costs, analyze benefits, right? Or actually, it was quantify costs and identify benefits. For some reason, they didn't, I guess you're supposed to quantify the costs, but only identify the benefits. Well, you actually should identify and quantify each, right? And rather than separate it as a separate step for cost and a separate step for benefits, I think it's better to separate it by task, right? So identify all the impacts, whether they be costs or benefits, right? And in fact, you may not even know in advance to what degree it's a cost or a benefit until you measure it, right? So, and then quantify it, which are 2 completely different things, by the way. The quantification requires different skills than identification, right? I think it's a better way to separate it than to separate them by task, identification versus quantification, as opposed to impact, cost versus benefit. Because the 2 tasks here are completely separate, right? the way you identify something, the way you quantify something are completely different. The perspective of the lens of somebody who wants to identify and think broadly about the impacts he or she might not be quantitative at all, right? But the quantification might be completely different. And so it's important to identify them first, as Ben Franklin did, listing the pros and the cons, and then you quantify them, right? And also, even if you can't quantify, you at least have to identify. When you confound identification and quantification, the tendency to maybe not list something, I can't really quantify that. And so when you're tasked, the step says quantify these things, and you can't quantify it, you might not even identify it. But it's important that you actually identify it, right? Even if you can't quantify it. So that's why I listed it as a separate step. Also, another reason to separate the steps by task and not the type of impact is that it's not clear what's a benefit, what goes in the benefit analysis, what goes in the cost analysis, right? Again, a benefit may be a reduced cost, or a cost may be a reduced benefit, right? And so instead of talking about them, analyzing cost, analyzing benefits separately, it's better to identify all the impacts, good and bad, and then quantify those impacts. Step 8 is to compare the alternatives. That is unchanged, if you will, from the step 7 of the Army CBA process, which is compare alternatives. However, I have a new step. I have taken the sensitivity analysis that was described under comparison of alternatives and separated it, because I think it's important enough for its own step, right? It was included in the comparison in the Army CBA approach, but I think the sensitivity analysis is so critical, right, that it should be separated. And I showed you, again, Army even seemed to recognize that step, compare alternatives, had 7A, B, C, D, E. There was a lot of elements in there, so they seem to recognize themselves that they might have tried to lump in too much under there. And so I think it's important, particularly in terms of the sensitivity analysis, to identify and characterize it as a completely separate step. And of course, finally, report the results and recommendations, which is unchanged, from the other process. So again, I ended up with 10 steps instead of 8. I've added a step, which was identifying the appropriate stakeholders. I added a step, which is conducting sensitivity analysis, although it's not really new. I took it out of the step of comparing alternatives. And then I changed the middle steps. Instead of separating the steps by whether it's do competitive cost analysis and benefit analysis, separate it by the task. Identify the impacts, quantify the impacts. Okay, having revised our cost-benefit analysis process a bit, let me talk about the next thing, which is the challenges and pitfalls of cost-benefit analysis. What are the dangers here? What are the problems with cost-benefit analysis? What are the challenges we face? Now, first, let me talk about a little bit about the accuracy of a cost-benefit analysis. Obviously, the value of any cost-benefit analysis depends on its accuracy, right? If you have an inaccurate CBA, you're going to have poor decisions. But the accuracy of the CBA, in turn, depends on how well the analyst performs each of the steps, right? So at every step, if you screw up a step, you could screw up the CBA. So, for example, if you have inaccurate assumptions, you're going to get an inaccurate cost-benefit analysis. If you do incorrect analysis, you're going to have an inaccurate CBA, right? At any step, if you do it wrong, you could have an inaccurate CBA, right? But every single step of the process is subject to potential error. So what are some of those potential errors? What are the common pitfalls in cost-benefit analysis that we should be aware of and avoid? Either you avoid them when you're conducting analysis, or make sure those who are conducting an analysis for you avoid these pitfalls. The first is selecting a set of alternatives that is either too narrow or too broad, right? If it's too broad, you are trying to do too much. You're going to spread yourself too thin. You're not going to be able to go into enough depth of detail on any individual alternative because you've analyzed so many different alternatives. And if it's too narrow, you might be excluding important alternatives that should be considered. You might Another pitfall is that you choose assumptions or selection criteria that bias it in favor of a desired result, right? And this can be either conscious or unconscious. If you consciously want an outcome, you could tweak the analysis to make that outcome come out. But often it could be unconscious. Is that you're trying to be unbiased, but you tend to have a outcome in mind, and you subconsciously create assumptions and selection criteria that steer you in that direction. Another common pitfall is the failure to recognize or predict important costs or benefits, right? Not looking too narrowly, right? About not seeing the impacts on all different stakeholders, not seeing the impacts over time, particularly when we're looking at forecasting the future. Another pitfall is related to non-monetary benefits and costs. When something is non-monetary, non-monetizable maybe, but certainly non-monetary, it's hard to get into the analysis, and so there might be a tendency to downplay it. Oh, it's not important. Well, it might be very important. You just can't quantify it very well, right? So you either downplay it, you ignore it, or maybe you assign an unrealistic value. Either you assign too small or too high a value, right? How much is a human life worth? Life is priceless. No, it's not, right? The bottom line is, if life was truly priceless, right, then you would get your brakes checked every single day. But we don't, right? Clearly, we do a cost-benefit analysis, and we choose to do things that risk our life based on a cost-benefit analysis. If life was truly priceless, we would be far more careful in our actions. Another common pitfall is the dealing with uncertainty, right? If you ignore uncertainty, you treat your assumptions and your predictions as if they are fact. This is what's going to happen. And if you fail to conduct the sensitivity analysis, which says, what if I'm wrong? Sensitivity analysis is basically saying, what if I'm wrong analysis, right? How wrong can I be and still get the same result? And that's very critical because there's so many levels of uncertainty. Whether it's looking at the future, whether it's the assumptions you make, the predictions you make, the estimates you make, all of those things, there's some level of uncertainty. Therefore, you have to conduct some sensitivity analysis to see if your results change if you are inaccurate in your assumptions or estimations or predictions. A further pitfall is that the comparison, that too often in assessing the effect of a new program or a new policy, you look at the benefits before and after the policy. That may seem to make sense, but it doesn't. What you really want to look at is what we call the counterfactual, right? What are the benefits with the policy versus what would the benefits have been without it? To understand that, let me give you an example, a graphical example, on the following slide. So suppose we have this situation where whatever it is, the net if we don't do anything, right, the net benefits will progress and will increase slightly over time, right? But we want to take an action, and this action will, in fact, increase the net benefits at a cost, right? We will incur a cost to do so, but it will improve the net benefits. And suppose action is taken at a certain time, labeled there, and with that action, we get an immediate increase and a continuing steady increase in the net benefits, right? And so we actually, it does create it increased net benefits, and the question is, does it justify the cost? Well, the pitfall is, suppose in particular, we want to figure out at time t, sometime after the action is taken, we want to say, well, how much better are we doing than we would, because of this action? How much better are we doing? How much improvement have we achieved because of this action? Well, if we label sort of these different points, they're A, B, and C, it's the appropriate comparison for calculating the impact of action, at least at that moment in time, is A versus B, not A versus C. Right? In particular, if we did A versus C, we're comparing before and after. right? Here's where we were. Those were the net benefits when we took the action, and now the net benefits now. And so clearly, sort of the at any point in time, the difference in net benefits is A minus C. Well, no, it's actually not. Because if you had done nothing, the benefits still would have increased to point B. And so the actual net benefits at that point in time is A minus B, not A minus C. Right? I'm sorry, not the net benefits. This is the increase in benefits from taking the action. We've got to then factor in the cost. And so if we compared A to C, we might say it justifies the cost, but maybe it doesn't if we compare A to B. So it's important to not just look at before and after, but with or without. So you got to sort of forecast what would happen with the action and what would happen without. Now, of course, A minus B is sort of the difference in benefits at that point in time. If we talk about all the difference in benefits over time, it would be that shaded area there, right? All the sort of benefits that are achieved at over every period in time, right? And compare that to the cost. Looking further at pitfalls, or if you will, games cost-benefit analysts play, and this is actually it's posted on Sakai. I asked you to read. There's a reading from Rosen and Gayer. It's actually, I've posted the entire chapter on cost-benefit analysis by Rosen and Gayer as a reference on the concepts and techniques of cost-benefit analysis, but I've actually then taken the single page that covers the games cost-benefit analyst play, and even though I'm duplicating myself, posted it separately to encourage you to read just that one page. And it talks about these games, 3 different games in particular, the chain reaction game, the labor game, and the double counting game that analysts can play. The chain reaction game is basically trying to increase the benefits of an action, right? And saying, well, these are the direct benefits, but hey, not only will it benefit these are the direct benefits, it will also then resonate, filter out to other markets, and there will be additional benefits. So you got to count those benefits as well. One example, and we might talk about this, I might even assign it later on. If you look at the article that's posted on Sakai under examples of CBA about MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, and their sort of economic impact study, and they're counting these benefits that maybe you shouldn't count. And there are, they probably play a little bit of each of these games here. But there's sort of 2 ways this chain reaction game works. One is that they may count gains that are simply transfers, right? The idea is to say, hey, look, this results in higher income for this group. But if it is higher income at, say higher prices that business can charge and therefore have higher profits, well, somebody's paying that price, right? So that's actually a transfer from consumers to the producers, right? The higher prices benefit the producers but hurt the consumers, and so it's a transfer. There's actually no increase in total net benefits. Another thing is to focus on the ripple effects or the secondary benefits, but not the secondary costs, right? So you sort of say, well, here are within this scope, here are the benefits. The secondary benefits is usually looking outside the scope, looking at other markets and other people who are affected, right? But if you only look at the benefits to other people, the other markets, other commands, other organizations within the Army, outside the Army, you've got to factor in also the secondary costs. So that's sort of a game that's played. Another one is the labor game, right? It's the whole broken windows theory, which is faulty in many ways. But the idea that, hey, look, when you break a window, it's good for the economy, because you break a window, somebody's got to come and fix it, so they get paid labor to fix the window, so it actually improves the economy. Well, no, it doesn't, right? Because what would that person have been doing otherwise? You got to think in terms of opportunity cost. First of all, when we think about one way the labor game is played is that they count wages as a benefit, right? Look, all these people get these wages, but it's actually a cost to you. It's certainly counted as a cost because it's money that's spent on wages that wouldn't have been spent on something else. So it's actually a cost, not a benefit. Or they count, for example, we're going to this project is going to employ 500 people. Therefore, we're going to increase employment by 500 people. No, you have 500 new jobs, but are all 500 of those people, one, were they all unemployed? Sitting unemployed when you hired them? If they took your job and were at another job, then you haven't actually increased employment. And also, even if they were unemployed, what would have happened if they hadn't taken your job? Maybe they would have gotten a different job in 2 weeks. So you haven't actually increased employment. You've just changed who that person's worked for, right? And so it's another game that is played. You got to, again, going back to the with or without, not the before and after, you've got to count what would have happened if you hadn't taken that action. And lastly, the double counting game, right? The idea of counting, as benefits two mutually exclusive perspectives, right? For example, right, you might say, well, we're going to invest in this particular asset. Maybe as the federal government will farm subsidies to improve irrigation on farmland, and that will allow farmers to generate this additional income stream because of the improved crop yields, and counting that income stream as a benefit, but also then counting, and it also increases the property value, so I'm counting that as a benefit. Well, you can't do both, right? You can't talk about how in a new bathroom, and I'm going to count the benefits as my enjoyment of that bathroom and the additional resale value I get from that new bathroom. You can't count it twice, right? When deciding whether or not to build a new bathroom, because ultimately, the fact that it increases the enjoyment of the house is the reason why the market value has gone up. You're either going to consume the asset, live in the house, or you're going to sell the asset, right? You can't do both, and you can't count them both. This sort of reminds me of, think about in the cost side it occurs too, but I think in terms of, if you watch Judge Judy and somebody comes in and says, you know what, I gave them my camera to repair and they lost my camera, so I want them to pay for the camera that they lost, and I also want them to buy me a new camera. Well, you can't have it both ways. Do you want them to pay for the camera that they lost, or do you want them to get you a new camera, right? You can't do both, right? But so often people, of course, come into, Judge Judy or the People's Court. Not that I watch those shows, of course, but I've been told, and ask for both, right? And that's, again, a double counting game. Another general concern or criticism sometimes of cost-benefit analysis deals with equity or distributional concerns, right? Because again, cost-benefit analysis tends to focus on the alternative with the highest net benefits. So you add up all the benefits among all the relevant stakeholders, all the costs among all the relevant stakeholders, and figure out which alternative has the greatest net benefits. But the problem is there are always winners and losers. Some people will incur costs or their benefits will go down. Some people will gain, their costs will go down and their benefits will go up. And simply, is it fair to simply, add those things up? For example, what if we were able to increase overall net benefits? Certainly, for example, there's an argument, for example, about wealth distribution. Right, the idea that, look, the economy has grown, but most of the growth in the economy, particularly since 2008, and in many times, if you measure even broader, there's been a concentration of growth of income in the top 1%, even the top 0.1%, right? So has average income gone up in the U.S.? Yes. Has it? But that's misleading in the sense that much of that has gone to a particular segment. And moreover, it could be that 90% of the population actually has lower income, but the other 10% has higher income, and the total net income goes up, and therefore the question is that a good thing? Well, the answer is, it is a good thing if the winners can compensate the losers, right? It's fine if the top 1% starts making a lot more money, even if it's at my expense, as long as they then are asked to share that with me, right? And that's the idea of cost-benefit analysis. The idea is that, look, we should maximize the net benefits because even though there are winners and losers, the gains the winners get outweigh the losses the losers experience. So the fact that for example, if I gain $1,000 in utility or benefit because of something, and you lose $500, right? I could give you $700, and you're better off, and I'm better off, right? Because I got $1,000 benefit. I still have $300 better off than I was before. You lost $500, but I gave you $700, so now you're $200 better off than you were before. Because the total gains exceed the total losses, the idea here, as the OMB Circular 894 says, the principle of maximizing net benefits is based on the premise that gainers could fully compensate the losers and still be better off, right? So the idea is that because the gains exceed the losses, we could have sort of a transfer from the winners to the losers and make everyone better off and avoid all these equity concerns, right? But in practice, of course, such compensation or redistribution rarely occurs, right? Every policy has winners and losers, and although theoretically we could make the winners pay off the losers' losses and the winners would still be winners, that doesn't often happen, right? So the idea here is that sometimes maximizing efficiency, in other words, maximizing total net benefit, sometimes raises equity or distributional concerns because, for example, what's good for the overall economy is going to be bad for certain segments of that economy. Okay, so if those are the challenges and pitfalls in cost-benefit analysis, what is the role of the cost-benefit analyst? Whether that be you as a direct analyst or you as someone who is going to be involved in cost management and looking at cost-benefit analyses of different ventures. Well, what's the contribution of a good cost-benefit analysis? What can a good cost-benefit analysis do? Well, they can hopefully make and test the appropriate assumptions, right? They're good at if you're good cost-benefit analysis, you know what assumptions to make, how to make those assumptions. You can test them, in other words, via sensitivity analysis. You are good at developing the right set of alternative courses of action, innovative, creative, unexpected options, right? Not too many to analyze, but a range of options. Hopefully, by being a good cost-benefit analysis, a good cost-benefit analyst can be very good at identifying impacts, identifying the relevant costs, identifying the relevant benefits, over time, across different stakeholders, right? But is able to think broadly about those impacts and identify them, and also able to hopefully properly quantify those. Right? Once they're identified, being able to quantify those. Those are sort of if you are or have working for you a good cost-benefit analyst, hopefully they can contribute those things. But another important thought about good cost-benefit analysis is the fact that it's both a science and an art, right? So a science means, if something is a science, right? Anything is science. There are a set of fundamental principles that help guide you through the process, right? That's what a science is that there's known facts. There are certain guiding principles, right? And this course is going to provide you an opportunity to learn those principles. Right? But cost-benefit analysis is also an art, right? In other words, not all elements of good cost-benefit analysis can be codified into a set of principles or procedures. I can't give you a checklist, and if you follow the checklist, you'll be as good as any other cost-benefit analyst. It doesn't work that way, right? There's certain things that remain an art. The ability to formulate the most reasonable and robust assumptions. The ability to uncover innovative and original alternative courses of action. The ability to recognize the full range of potential costs and benefits. Identifying creative ways to quantify non-monetary impacts. Now, mastering those elements requires practice, right? And so, in addition to teaching the principles, we're also going to, through the exercises, through project, through case study analysis, we're going to give you the practice as well, right? The idea here is that, look, you can't read a textbook. You can learn about swimming by reading about it, but you're not going to become a good swimmer unless you swim. You can learn how to play the guitar from reading a book, but you're not going to be a good guitarist unless you actually practiced the guitar. you have to actually, because it's not just a science and an art, but an art, it's something you have to practice to get good at. And so you will get certainly the principles, you'll get mostly the science during this part of the cost management certificate course, but you will get some of the art. But the expectation, of course, is that you will get experienced in, if not conducting, at least reviewing cost-benefit analysis reports, such that you will refine this art and become a better artist as time goes by. So finally, we conclude with a summary. So what is the summary and sort of the key takeaways here? Well, the first is, remember that to recognize that cost-benefit analysis has become embedded in Army decision-making, right? Many of you will be active users, either helping develop CBAs or at least reviewing them for senior decision-makers. And that cost-benefit analysis can help promote better resource-informed decisions, right? And make better use of increasingly constrained resources. Also, hope you recognize that cost-benefit analysis has a well-designed and proven process, right? The idea is, although some elements still remain an art rather than science, there are principles that you can learn, a process you can follow, and be steered in the right direction. And finally, it's important to emphasize that cost-benefit analysis is a valuable input to managerial decision-making, but it's not a replacement for it. It doesn't make the decision for you, right? And I like a quote here's a quote from Michael Drummond, who's a cost-benefit analyst who focuses on the medical field primarily, but award-winning guy. He says, "It is best to think of the cost-benefit approach as a way of organizing thought rather than as a substitute for it." So with that, we have completed our first presentation for our first class of this new course. Later this week, this will be supplemented with another shorter presentation. It won't require 3 different parts from my colleague Dan Nussbaum, which has a little bit more of the Army context, if you will, for cost-benefit analysis. All right. Thank you very much.